Dr. Maya Angelou said, if you're going to live, leave a legacy. Make a mark on the world that can't be erased. Our next session will hone in on women's legacy and the future in forestry, paving the way to progress. We have the opportunity to hear from two phenomenal ladies. We will hear from Edie Sony Hall, who is the founder and principal of the Three Trees Consulting, which provides expertise in forest carbon accounting, ecosystem services, green building, life cycle assessment, and sustainable forest certification. She works across all parts of the forest sector in the US and internationally, from nonprofits working with small landowners to large companies and associations to the government. During her PhD work, she became interested in climate change and the role forests and forest products can play in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. She has also worked as a research forester for International Paper in Southern Georgia. Edie has spent a lifetime loving trees and grew up in the Northeast, spending weekends hiking around the woods with her family. In addition to a professional and academic career in forestry, she is a family tree farmer, growing trees in South Carolina. Edie has her doctorate and master's in forestry from the University of Washington and her bachelor's in environmental biology from Yale University. We will also be hearing from Rachel Klein. Rachel is a second generation Forest Service employee working as a project manager and supervisor in history and knowledge management for the last 13 years with the USDA Forest Service. There, she has had roles for diversity, equity, and inclusion, participating in the Multicultural Committee, and producing the Her Story Oral History Project. She has taught at the collegiate level and offered numerous webinars on Forest Service history. She serves as the Forest History Society Forest Service liaison and volunteers on her local Historic Preservation Commission. She holds a doctorate from the University of New Hampshire, where she explored the history of women in conservation and the Forest Service, as well as a master's in public history from Colorado State University. Rachel, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Mia, for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Tamberly, for getting the jitters out of me. That was really helpful this morning. It's really amazing to be with you all, convening at the first inaugural Women's Forest Congress. You know, when former Associate Justice Ruth Ginsburg said, when there are nine, I knew what she meant, right? But standing in front of this room full of women, I really get it now. I feel it and I see it. It's really powerful. As a historian, the weight of this moment in history does not escape me. The first American Forest Congress met in Cincinnati's Eden Park in 1882, and 140 years later, here we are in Minneapolis. As we see today, women certainly have a present in forestry, as well as a bright future, as Edie will later describe. But women also have a long-standing history in this field that even predates that first Congress. Most of our conversation over the last 3 days has revolved around diversity and inclusion. And I would argue that in order to have an inclusive present and future, we also have to recognize an inclusive past. Women have a long legacy in forestry and conservation, and you are the inheritors of that history. And what struck me most while being here and listening is that what's been said here over the past 3 days is what women have been saying since 1850, at least in print. Access, diversifying, collaborating, creating connections, relationships, ecosystems approach. These are all things that have been on women's minds for over a century in relationship to nature. This conference hasn't been focused on the technical aspects of work. Can you all talk about that stuff? Of course you can. But without the relationships and the collaboration, it's just data or process. And that's what women bring, that rich texture of relationship. and they have for a century. I've been researching women in conservation and forestry for a number of years, but this passion goes back further for me to my childhood, as I played on the Roosevelt National Forest, or I spun in my grandfather's chair at the Rocky Mountain Research Station in Fort Collins, Colorado. My grandfather held many roles in fire and administration, and even as Smokey Bear, as you can see, for the U.S. Forest Service for 30 years. But I also watched my grandmother support his position in ways that I couldn't really comprehend at the time. And I now know that my grandparents were part of a richly steeped tradition of an all-hands-on-deck approach to forestry, and that my grandmother and other women played a tremendous role in the creation, organization, and execution of that forestry. These are a few of my family photos of my grandparents, my mother and aunt. My Nana hosted a fish fry every Friday, while Papa worked on the Lincoln National Forest in New Mexico during the 1960s. I've been so fortunate to follow in their footsteps, working for the Forest Service for over 13 years now. I've visited or worked on over 60 forests and grasslands, and I've worked in every region of the agency. When I got my job, my papa quipped, "They hire historians?" But he thought it was really amazing what I was doing and when I joined the agency. And I am so proud to work in this field and use history to inform land management decisions. And I'd like to note that while I love working for the U.S. Forest Service, today I'm sharing my personal research. And that is a story that is too often untold, that women have been involved in forestry and conservation since the 19th century. And it's their approach to land and nature that has ushered modern forestry, conservation, and agencies like the Forest Service into the 21st century. And as Edie will describe in a few minutes, how women will take that into the future. To quote the illustrious rapper Pitbull, "To understand the future, we have to go back in time." So mainstream history has long held that men have been the center of the story. And they have most certainly held, until recently, most, if not all, professional and leadership positions within the field. We talk about all the greats like Henry David Thoreau, George Perkins Marsh, John Muir, President Theodore Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot, who was the father of the Forest Service, and America's first professional forester, and Aldo Leopold, who's considered to be the originator of the term land ethic, which calls for an ethical, caring relationship between people and nature. Meanwhile, women were excluded from forestry schools, as well as professional and technical forestry positions and leadership for the first half of the 20th century. And they fought hard. Wait, where was I? This is really nerve-wracking, guys, right? All right. So women were excluded from these schools, and they fought hard to move into those positions in the latter half of the century. But this doesn't mean women haven't been present in forestry from the beginning. So are these men on the screen important? Absolutely. They're very much part of the story, but they're only half. And as Jackie spoke about on Monday evening, let's address the other half. Because while they may have been excluded from a male-dominated forestry field, they made their own, what these early women called a feminine forestry and a conservation cause. So first, I'd like to introduce you to Susan Fenimore Cooper. Some of you may know of her. She was the devoted daughter of James Fenimore Cooper, the famous American author, who's known for The Last of the Mohicans. But she's so much more than that. Beginning in the mid-19th century, Susan Fenimore Cooper was an integral voice within early American nature conversations. And it would be her work that would lay the foundation for women in conservation. Cooper's observations of nature as part of the home and community were pivotal in the formation of women's nature appreciation at the time. She provided a model for women to engage with natural subjects and advocate for their preservation as a moral obligation, calling on them to awaken their interest in nature, which may lead them to what she called something higher. 4 years before Thoreau published Walden, Cooper published her Rural Hours in 1850. Rural Hours is the first nature writing text to be published by a woman in the United States, and the book saw 4 decades of success with numerous editions and reprints. You should buy it. It was written in the style of a daily journal, capturing Cooper's observations over a period of 2 years of the seasons, flora and fauna of her native upstate New York. But more than just daily musings, Cooper saw patterns of climate change, loss of species, and unsustainable environmental practices, and she feared for the loss of the American landscape in 1850. Cooper advocated that Americans approach the landscape, quote, more humbly and gratefully and with less greed, end quote, by creating a sustainable balance between humans and nature. While she praised the social spirit of the land modestly shaped by the laborer and the husbandman, she criticized the unsustainable practices of Americans depleting forests and species for the use of one generation. Sound familiar? Throughout her work spanning 43 years, Cooper repeatedly reported the loss of American wildflower species, the diminishing numbers of migrating birds, the decrease of fish, the reduction of wildlife like moose, stags, deer, wolves, and martens killed for their fur or displaced by woodcutters. On forestry, she criticized practices like pollarding or lopping the heads off of trees. She called such a mutilation of trees as unethical and a deplorable practice that wasted whole trees for fleeting pursuits. She also spoke on the exploitation of old-growth trees. Cooper's remedy for this exploitation was to connect nature and forest to the home as a way for Americans to understand the value of trees and why they should care. Writing, quote, "The earth is the common home of all," she asserted that Americans had a moral obligation to know and recognize the nature around them. So Cooper's call to this something higher planted a seed in the minds of 19th century women to recognize the importance and value of nature, and she was quickly followed in print. We also know that Thoreau read her because he cites her, revealing that this was certainly a conversation involving both men and women. So who are some of these other women? Elizabeth Wright, Olive Thorne Miller, Celia Thaxter, Sarah Orne Jewett, Edith Thomas, Anna Botsford Comstock, Jean Stratton Porter, and Mary Hunter Austin are just a few who wrote on natural history, the importance of nature, the progressive depletion of the natural world, the need for thoughtful preservation, and the assertion of nature not as other, but as home. In 1918, Mary Austin, who's looking really cool in that hat, credited women's capacity for intuitive judgment as their platform from which to speak, stating women should bring to nature writing, quote, not their ability to see the world in the way men see it, but the importance and validity of their seeing it some other way. During the Progressive Era, which was 1890 to 1920, thousands of women took up Cooper's appeal for nature appreciation and preservation, and they advocated for the protection of birds, forests, and watersheds. Like Cooper, they claimed that preserving American nature preserved American life. One of these women during this period was botanist Mira Lloyd Dock. She was the most prominent spokeswoman for scientific forestry at the turn of the century. A wealthy Pennsylvanian, Dock was a lecturer, clubwoman, and public official, being the first woman to serve on an official conservation board. Her scientific know-how and passion for forestry enabled her to educate women about conservation, but also gave her the ear of professional men. She was friends of Gifford Pinchot and other male foresters, and she gained favor within the professional forestry circuit that enabled her to expand her own education, which was not available to most women at the time, as well as assert her influence into the pressing forestry issues of the day. She also taught aspiring male foresters at the Pennsylvania State Forest Academy and even created portions of the curriculum. Let's sink in for a second. Women are excluded, but we're creating the curriculum. A forest owner herself, she permitted the school to use her property for their experimental field school. And Dock really highlights how women circumnavigated the exclusion of women in forestry by studying something else, like botany, and becoming an authority in forestry anyway. So as I was researching these women, particularly in the early Forest Service, I kept coming across this phrase that they would use. It was just everywhere. It's the conservation cause. While women engaged in all kinds of conservation work, a constant thread throughout their records is their shared idea of this conservation cause based on the greatest good. So Gifford Pinchot captured this philosophy in his use of the utilitarian maxim, the greatest good for the greatest number, derived from English writer Jeremy Bentham, to which he added, in the long run. This philosophy for the new agency emphasized that forest management should consider the many needs of forest users and implement long-term decisions that best serve the most people as well as the environment over time. The question of who was best fit to determine the greatest good was answered with the progressive credo of efficient government regulation based on scientific management. And meanwhile, the many women who worked for the Forest Service since its earliest days took conservation and, like Pinchot, they made it their own. While Forest Service women heartily subscribed to the ideal of scientific management, they added to it a deeper environmental concern and tied it to American morality, culture, and citizenship. In their minds, the practice of forestry was not only for the benefit of the lumberman or the carpenter, but also for the cultivation of relationships between tree life and human life. So let's take a look at some of these other women. The first woman I'd like to discuss is Edith Mosier, who worked for the Forest Service from 1905 to 1920. And she's known as the founder of conservation education in the agency. And I just love how her story begins. It's almost like a superhero origin story. She was an elementary school teacher, and as she was standing in front of her blackboard preparing a lesson inspired by a small peach branch that she held in her hand, it dawned on her. There were no decent instructional books on nature in 1900 with which to teach her students. So she's thoroughly irritated at this lack of useful nature texts, and she vowed to illustrate her own set of nature books for school children. So she bought a ticket to Washington, D.C. She told her boss she was going to attend a teachers' conference. But once she got there, she sold her return ticket, she took a civil service exam, and wham, she was hired by the General Land Office. And then she moved to the Forest Service once it was established in 1905, and she didn't look back. So while she was a clerk under Pinchot, she began illustrating those nature texts that she had promised outside of her normal duties. And in 1907, she published her first booklet, Fruit and Nut-Bearing Trees. And the agency saw the value in her work and supported her, leading her to publish her second and third booklets, Our Oaks and Maples and Our Cone-Bearing Trees, in 1909. And the hallmark of these nature texts were her full-page illustrations, roughly 30 close-up scientific and just beautiful drawings. And within the text, she mixed in scientific observations and lessons for teachers. While she started out wanting to provide school children with more detailed textbooks, her efforts turned into a larger initiative of sharing with students conservation as a cultural obligation with an entreaty to protect the forest as a civic responsibility. And how she accomplished this was to connect literature, poetry, and thoughts about American life with nature. She used poetry and verse, often to set the stage. For example, she begins the booklet Oaks and Maples with the poem from William Wordsworth. One impulse from the vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil, and of good than all the sages can. In 1917, she published Forest Study in the Primary Grades, which is the first Forest Service textbook for children that had numerous lessons for school teachers and again combined poetry and scientific observation. And I think one of her greatest contributions is her poem that gets children to think about fire prevention long before Smokey ever did. What do we burn when we burn our trees? We burn the home for you and me. We burn the carriage house, barn and shed, the baby's cradle, the little boy's sled. The bookcase, the table, the rocker of ease, we burn all these when we burn our trees. What do we burn when we burn our trees? The homes of birds, the squirrels and bees. The home of the brook and the cooling spring, where violets blossom and bluebirds sing. The beauties of nature so fair to please, we burn all these when we burn our trees. So through this poem and others in her forest study, Mosier emphasized that learning forest conservation issues as a young student made children better citizens and people. She argued that with a love for nature and understanding of the interconnectedness of forests and humans, children would grow into adults and citizens more apt to solve the pressing issues facing forests and natural resources. And through poetry and prose, she convinced readers to care for and protect forests as a personal responsibility. Following in her vein was Daisy Priscilla Edgerton, who worked for the Forest Service Division of Information and Education from 1923 to 1938. In 1927, she authored The Forest, a handbook for teachers, which was a bestseller. Like Mosier, Edgerton used literature and culture as a means of understanding and relating to forestry. She also authored a textbook in 1930, one of the first of its kind, called Southern Forest: First Steps in Forest Study. And from what I understand in some of the conservation education programs, they still use these lessons. Pretty cool. In 1931, she wrote, "There's perhaps no set of women workers in Uncle Sam's army of federal employees more loyal and enthusiastic for the cause and the job than those in the Forest Service." "Wherever she goes, young forests begin to grow," is what a children's newspaper wrote in 1940 of Margaret Marchmount. As the director of women's forestry in the Forest Service, yes, there was a women's forestry program in the Forest Service, she spoke to thousands of women across the country to convince them of their moral obligation to care for nature and trees. Reading this woman's schedule made me tired. She gave talks to women's clubs, wrote articles, presented lecture, and gave radio addresses, sometimes all on the same day. She spoke about conservation programs, planting trees, and fire prevention, and why it all mattered. In particular, she popularized the Penny Pines campaign, a children's conservation campaign to encourage students to donate pennies to fund the planting of pines on national forests. In exchange for every penny given, the Forest Service planted 2 or 3 pines. For every $4 received, the Forest Service promised to plant 1,000 seedlings in states where pines would grow. She raised so much money for trees, you can still see her forest standing across the country today. In 1942, Marchmount wrote in an article for American Forest magazine that, quote, "No longer is forestry wholly a man's profession. The wonder world of the forest is now a woman's world also." She outlined that the goal of the women's forestry program was to make women into forest builders who would protect the forest as their home. She claimed that women could build careers at home as foresters, working on the, quote, "human side of forestry." And Marchmount's program revealed the contrast in men's and women's approach to forest conservation, that while Forest Service men predominantly viewed timber as a crop to be harvested, women desired to build up forests and to enhance American life. And in the midst of war, she reminded Americans that while bombs explode, trees grow. And from that assurance, Americans could find resolve to preserve and protect their forests, homes, and way of life, even in uncertainty. In the tradition of Susan Fenimore Cooper and the 19th century women naturalists, the well-known Dr. Eloise Jerry, who's the first female research scientist hired in the Forest Service, she also connected her scientific findings with community values. In 1924, she wrote a 4-part series of short stories for children featured in American Forest magazine called The Pine Burr Stories. Each story followed a child's adventure into the woods to inspect trees with father or play with cousins, decorate the Christmas tree made from the delights of the forest, and help plant seeds to grow new forests. By connecting the stories to the daily lives of children, Jerry showed the importance of large forests and tiny seeds to young children and put a relatable human face on scientific practice. So these are just a handful of women who carried out the conservation cause through their work and outreach. I could talk literally all day about the lookouts, the foresters, the librarians, the clerks, the map drawers, the rangers' wives, all of those women in research who did so much. I've hardly scratched the surface this morning, but there's a clock here and it's counting down on me. But I'd like to bring Rachel Carson into the room for a minute. I think she would be really in awe at what we're doing here today. Carson, who was well-grounded in science, embodied what might be thought of as the hallmarks of women's environmentalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And she brought to scientific resource management a sense of wonder and sentimental appreciation, encouraging parents to share nature with children. "I sincerely believe," said Carson, "that for the child and for the parent seeking to guide him, it is not half so important to know as to feel. If facts are the seeds that later produce knowledge and wisdom, then the emotions and the impressions of the senses are the fertile soil in which the seeds must grow." So for women in conservation like Carson, Mosier, Edgerton, and Marchmount, and many others, the chief aims were educating Americans about resource issues, taking responsibility for nature, and connecting people with the land. Women's early conservation cause has taken on a modern appearance as environmental concern, merging contemporary ecosystem management and newfound professional and field positions with women's historic approach to conservation, focusing less on timber harvests and more on multiple uses, increased diversity in forest planning, wilderness designations, and community-based environmental problems. Women's emphasis on a culturally minded conservation philosophy to preserve American life has been instrumental in helping to redirect forestry, and in particular, the Forest Service's management focus to one more closely aligned with the general public's environmental ethos. Today, women continue to reflect on that philosophy of a conservation cause. Leslie Weldon, Senior Executive for Work Environment and Performance offered, "I am not alone among women in the Forest Service in sharing a conservation ethic. This commitment has a shared central ethos that we must work with the people we serve to fulfill our conservation mission." Dr. Grisel Gonzalez, Director of the International Institute of Tropical Forestry, the first woman to hold that title, added that delivering our conservation mission is about openness and willingness to work across multiple disciplines and a diverse community of partners. And I'll never forget what Gloria Brown said to me once, that the essence of her career was about her relationships with the people she worked with and the land she cared for. So while my research is primarily associated with women in the Forest Service, there are so many more stories of women in forestry, landowners, private industry, state forests, to name just a few, still to tell. But as this Congress proves, you're not alone on this journey, and you haven't been for over a century. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Oh my gosh. I don't know when my slides come up, but here they are. Oh my gosh. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here. I know everyone who comes up here just gets this moment of, wow, this is incredible. Well, my name is Edie Sani Hall, and I am here to talk about the future of women in forestry. I am going to set the scene and make the case for why women in forestry are needed to lead the way to harness the power, the incredible benevolent power of trees. I might throw a little bit of science in just because that's what I do, but it's mostly going to be inspiring. But first, I want to give a shout out to the past. Rachel did an incredible job highlighting the largely unappreciated contributions women have always made to the field of forestry. But it goes without saying that these contributions were largely unappreciated because women were not allowed to be in the roles that had the most public influence. So I want to also acknowledge the more recent past, my mentors and those in the decades that have come before me, and right now, those women who have put their foot, their hand, their nails, whatever they could, into that weighted elevator door that goes up to those leadership room and says, "Excuse me, I believe there's room for one more." Because you have shown that women can do any job a man can do. So thank you for all the work and the sacrifices that you have made to get the room ready for us. Because look at us, we are here and we are ready. So first, a little about me. I love trees. I love trees so much that I named my kids after them. But it is the scale of forests and landscapes that I spend most of my career. I can now call myself a women-owned small business owner. I work with organizations of all types, from nonprofits to industry to government, individual companies, and I help bridge the gap between science and policy and management. I am also a women-owned tree farmer. with some land that has been in my family for generations, and some land that has been recently purchased with my husband. Some trees have been purposely planted on abandoned agriculture land in South Carolina on the grounds of the Shakora and the Waccamaw. Others have naturally regenerated around old stone walls of failed agriculture lands in upstate New York on the grounds of the Mohawk. Still others have filled in and burned after multiple decades of fire suppression and more recently fire in north central Washington on the Okanagan territory of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville. Being a family tree farmer is one of the reasons why I pursued a career in forestry, and it certainly provides an important perspective. Through my jobs and my land and my hobbies, I have studied trees and forests at many different scales, from global projects with the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, down to measuring the microfibril angle in wood cells when I worked as a wood quality research scientist. I have spent the last 20 plus years focusing on climate change and how forests and forest products can help reduce atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions. And I also follow closely how climate change will, and in many cases have, impacted forests around the world. And every day, I am more and more convinced of the power of trees and their ecosystems to help us. I mean, really help us. So what is the problem? The problem is we have a planetary resource constraint issue, and we have not been very strategic about solving it. Currently, the world extracts 100 billion tons of natural resources annually, which we use for society's needs, from housing to transportation to food. The quantity of natural resources extracted annually has increased 12-fold between 1900 and 2015, and these are expected to double again by 2050. Currently, 74% of annual resource extraction are of non-renewable resources. 40% of global carbon emissions come from the building sector. 8% of global emissions come from concrete. However, much of society's needs can be met with renewable alternatives. Almost everything that is currently made from fossil fuel, from chemicals to packaging to plastic composites, fabrics, and personal care products, can be made from renewable resources, including wood. Not only are forest resources a solution to resource scarcity, but they can play an essential role in providing low carbon and even negative carbon products and energy. Forests also provide other absolutely essential services. 50% of the US population rely on forests to filter their drinking water. 6% of US forests are within 100 feet of a water body. US forests support 17,464 native species, 15,256 vascular plants, 1,014 invertebrates that we know of, 459 birds, 233 mammals, 226 reptiles, 216 amphibians, and 60 freshwater fish. They also provide flood control, air purification, and shade in cities. And of course, my favorite, recreation. Nature RX is the real deal. So the bottom line is that trees and forests can do everything. So what's the problem, right? We have the solution. Well, then why is this so hard? Well, we all know trees are dynamic over space and time, and so they do not provide all ecosystem services on every acre or continuously over time. And this makes it harder to plan. And until now, we haven't really had to plan, as the Earth's land has been relatively large relative to our population and resource needs. The Earth has 10.6 billion hectares of workable land, and that is basically a fixed asset. But we have a growing population, and we already overshoot our annual planetary resource allocations. So we are now at a point in time where our population is too large to have inefficient uses of land. And this is a reality. But what is also a reality is that we have been really inefficient about our land use, and we have not been applying systems thinking. And this is where the natural strengths of women come in. What are some of the strengths of women? Women tend to be optimizers versus maximizers. Women are naturally good at incorporating trade-offs and managing for both the short term and the long term. Women also tend to have compassion and seek cooperation. And maybe it's because women have more practice with all of these. Look around the room at all of you. Over the past week, likely many at your table have been juggling work, arranging carpools, scheduling dentist appointments 3 months out, and deciding which are the essential actions needed to meet short, mid, and long-term goals. Or you're caring for your parents and your kids and community members and making sure that no one is fighting. And you are all trying hard. And you sometimes fail. But you are thinking about how to balance and how to find practical solutions to give everyone what they need, including you. And I'm not saying that one person needs to do everything, but as a whole, the system must consider everything. And if you are smart, you are enlisting the help of your village, your support. This is important because teamwork and cooperation are what is needed to help harness the power of trees. No one person is going to solve this. So what do we need to consider? The saying goes, for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. We know there is not a simple solution. We know that we need to consider context, sustainability, resilience, and the latest research. And if we do all of these, we can absolutely have a world with healthy, resilient, productive forests that are providing renewable resources for our growing population. So how do we get there? Here are 4 key elements that will help us harness the power of trees: courage, communication, teamwork, and joy. Courage. First off, you have information in your brain based on your set of learned knowledge and experience that is important to put on the table. It is important because it is likely not already on the table. You have to speak up, even if you don't have the entire answer. And if you don't have the entire answer, say that. Wouldn't it be fantastic if we could all clarify our statements with, I feel 80% sure about what I'm about to say. And the men too, this would be fantastic. So speak up, even if you don't know everything. Communication. Figure out how you best communicate and what your weaknesses are. Some people only provide information when asked. If it is hard for you to find the courage to provide the information you know, find an ally that enjoys being the butterfly. I will tell you that I am an introvert, And if someone asks, I can talk for hours and hours of things I know about. Yay, trees. But I don't proactively offer this information. So I have discovered that I need to align myself with extroverts. Thank you, Jane. Because I have found that I so appreciate the strengths of different people. There is not one person who can do everything. So partnerships and teams are essential. Speaking of teams, man, this is important. A team works well when they have a common goal, when there is trust, and when people care about the goal and about each other. I have been on some incredible teams, and it sure feels good. It's like the energy that comes from within every person forms together into one giant superpower. And you know the saying, there is no I in team. That is absolutely true. But I've also thought a lot recently about what our team is in the larger sense. If we are on Team Trees, why does it seem like we have so much fighting or miscommunication even among ourselves? And when I say ourselves, I mean the larger forest sector, environmentalists, industry, different parts of the value chain, academia, government. We all have a common goal, right? We all want healthy, resilient, productive forests, and we all want humans to have the resources we need to live in. But perhaps we are so accustomed to teams of people we know and the people we trust. So just as we have to embrace diversity of management types over space and time, it's time to ask ourselves, who's on my team and what are we all fighting for? Well, I'm here to tell you to open up that tent because we are all on the same team and we are fighting for our planet, not only to survive, but to thrive. Finally, find your balance. We all need this reminder in an age where we are constantly tethered to our phone and on call for responding to work 24/7. No one is productive 24/7. You need to find an outlet that recharges your battery. I can't stress this enough. Get a hobby or 5. Get rest, get exercise, meditate. I need to do that, but I don't. But also find the joy. So here's the deal. For a very long time, I have had a secret walkout song. You know, the kind of thing that if you're the CEO of a company or a Major League Baseball player, that's what you do. So, except mine has only been played in my house over and over again, much to my kids' dismay. And when I forced my kids to have a dance party. Well, a couple of weeks ago, people are starting to get nervous, I know this. Don't worry. A couple of weeks ago, as I was prepping for this awesome event, it hit me. Now is my chance. I could finally have an excuse to be on stage and dance around to a rowdy crowd playing Timber by Pitbull. Yeah, Pitbull Kesha, sorry. Okay, now don't get excited. Don't get stressed out. I'm not doing it. Don't worry. Because I have been rightfully warned that we don't have the copyright license. I even asked my husband to buy it for me for my birthday, but that didn't actually happen. But in the meantime, this is a story about finding joy, by the way. So in the meantime, I had a week of pure and utter joy. I actually rewrote the lyrics. It's a masterpiece. I envisioned Smokey the Bear coming on stage during the rapping part. And I even got a friend to come up and choreograph dance moves that you could all do in your seat. It was going to be amazing. But more importantly, I laughed so hard. I haven't laughed that hard in years. And it was pure joy. So someday you guys will see it, but it won't be today. But my point is, have fun and laugh. And that leads me back to forests, because this is usually where I find my joy. They are always the highlight and always the center. We are in awe at their resilience, and we are also in awe of their longevity. But we're also in awe of their dynamic nature. And we want to figure out how to have 10 billion people living well within the limits of this planet. We can't do this without harnessing the renewability of trees. We are at the point in time where our population is too large to have inefficient uses of land. Of land and resources. As Rachel quotes Pitbull, to understand the future, we have to go back in time. So it has been really important over this past hour to understand the incredible ways that women have influenced our conservation and balanced role with natural resources to date. But as we've learned, we've had to be sneaky about it. We've had to pretend it was someone else's idea or prove that we can do it in the way that the man does it. Well, now it's time to let our strengths shine. Let's look at the whole picture and let's search for the win-wins across space and time. And you know that room where it happens, where we've finally broken through that door? I think it's time to redecorate. Thank you. We have time for a few seconds. No, we are not I'm not singing Timber, the new song. Okay, I'll the verse. You know this song, like, it's going down. Okay, so when it goes to like swing your partner round and round, okay, it goes carbon cycles round and round, put those trees into the ground. One more chance for us to say, trees are here to save the day. Go on up, Rachel.
We do have a few minutes for Q&A, so does anyone have any questions for Edie and Rachel? We have one right there? Okay, Amy's getting the mic. If you don't mind to stand up, and Amy's gonna bring you the mic.
This is an easy question. For my notes, can you tell me what the first name of Mosier was?
Edith.
Edith.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, one right here. Right here. Stand up, please. So she. Sure. Yep.
That's hard to find. I find it very, oh wow, now I'm really loud. I find it very difficult to find time to dig for those hidden things that we know are there about women in history. And I was just wondering if you could give some advice or some practical suggestions about how we could, sorry, I'm out of breath. One of the, I guess, how could people and myself most efficiently start looking for that information and cataloging it, because it's really important.
That's such a great question. Tell people what you're interested in. For 10 years, people would just send me stuff because I was that lady in the Forest Service who liked women's history. And over time, I just had this huge collection of things. So talk to people, tell them you're interested. The other thing is look in the places that we don't normally look at. So we all think about the final report. Go look at the draft report. Go dig in your files and look at drafts, because that's usually where women's handwriting is and their little notes, the things that they would have written while that, in my example, that forest ranger was dictating to them, right? They were including their own notes. So look at drafts, read between the lines. A lot of history, women's history in particular, is difficult sometimes is because it's not overt, right? We have to read between the lines. We have to hold that page up to the light and kind of look at what's not being said. And that's where we can start to ask questions. So, you know, it's what I do, so at least I get to have the time to go uncover those things. But it's looking in obscure collections. It's going through that filing box, that, you know, that banker's box that's been in that corner of your office for 10 years. Go look through it. There are so many times there are treasure troves of things that we just dismiss because we're not consciously thinking about it. And that's typically where women's history, minority history is. I also do a lot of oral history to get those records of women, of people of color that weren't recorded earlier. Those stories are still poignant today. Look at photographs, look at buildings. Architectural history is an amazing resource. You can learn a lot just from looking at a building, the way things are organized inside, where the restrooms are, things like that. It really speaks a lot to women's roles. So things like that. Does that help a little bit?
I had a question for Edie. Edie, you said you're the proprietor of a women-owned small business. I was wondering, we've got a lot of women at all career stages here. If you could talk about how you were able to take your passions and turn them into a consulting business where, from what I've seen, you're able to push forward a lot of very similar priorities for a lot of clients. And it seems like you found a lot of purpose and motivation in doing that. And I think that would be interesting for folks in the room.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, well, I have been in this business of my own consulting for about 5 years now. And I have to say, I have a pretty specific niche that happens to be a pretty hot topic right now. When I started this, by the way, my dissertation 20 years ago, I told my professors that I wanted to work on carbon and climate change, and they were like, you have to be either an economist or a entomologist, or, you know, you have to specialize. I was like, no, I need to know all of it, because that's what problem is about. So I have found a specific niche, and the niche actually is pretty important to work across broad spectrums. But I would say the advice on going after this is it really truly is about how connections, do your job well, and talk to other people as that one thing leads to another, to another, to another. So thank you.
Sorry, I have a question for you, Edie. Thank you so much, both of you. This has been amazing. I have had the pleasure of being a part of the Greatest Forest Challenges sub-theme. And one of the things we identified early on is the need to incorporate systems thinking into the forest sector. And so if you were to identify a few ways that might be operationalized, what would you suggest?
No, you're making me, I mean, you're not making me, you're allowing me to to talk about my passion. But I'm gonna back up very broadly. So I actually think that foresters are sort of uniquely adapted at thinking about systems thinking, because a forest is really truly dynamic over space and time and impacts so many different things. So we've always been taught, you know, an ecosystem is a system. We've always known that you do something here and it impacts something there, right? But often when we're trying to sort of set a goal, sometimes that goal itself constricts the boundary of what we're looking at. And my greatest advice is to think about what the problem it is you're trying to solve and make sure that the boundary that you're setting of whatever you're doing matches up with that ultimate goal so that you're not missing something. That's going to be my broadest way to go about that.
Well, thank you, Rachel and Edie. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you all so much.